Set base URL for REST in Spring Boot Introduction. In Spring Boot, REST APIs are usually accessed through URLs like http://8080/API/users. Often, you want all your APIs to share a common base URL, such as API v1 service app. This is called the base URL or base path. Setting a base URL is important for organizing APIs versioning, API v1, consistency across endpoints, easier maintenance, gateway routing, microservices. Understanding how to set a base URL in Spring Boot is essential for building clean and scalable REST APIs. What does set base URL for REST mean? It means defining a common prefix for all REST endpoints. In simple terms, base URL equals common starting path for all API endpoints. Example: base URL, API endpoint, users, final URL, /API/users. Example concept. Base path plus endpoint means full API URL. Why this is important? Without a base URL, users, orders, products. With a base URL, API users, API orders, API products. Benefits: better API structure, easier API versioning, /API/v1, avoids conflicts with other routes, cleaner URL design. Example concept. Consistent base means organized APIs. Method 1, using @request mapping at class level. The simplest and most common way is to define a base path at the controller level. Example import org.springframework.web.bind.annotation. REST controller, @request mapping, API, public class user controller, get mapping -users, public string get users, return list of users. URL, API, users. Example concept. @request mapping plus get mapping equals users means /API:users. Method 2, base URL per controller. Each controller can have its own base path. Example @REST controller, @request mapping, API users, public class user controller. @get mapping, public string get users, return users. REST controller, request mapping, API, orders, public class order controller. Get mapping, public string get orders, return orders. Example concept. Controller level base means endpoint paths simplified. Method 3, global base URL, using application.properties. You can define a global base path for all endpoints. Application.properties, server.servlet.contextPath equals API. Now all endpoints automatically get /API prefix. Example @get mapping users. Final URL, API users. Example concept. Context path means applied to entire application. Method 4, using application.yml server, servlet context path, #API. Same effect as properties file. Method 5, API versioning in base URL. You can include versioning in the base URL. Example @REST controller, @request mapping, API v1 users, public class user controller. Get mapping, public string get users, return users v1. Example concept. API v1 means versioned API. This helps when upgrading APIs, maintaining backward compatibility. Method 6, combining global plus controller base. You can combine both. Application.properties, servlet.contextPath equals API. Controller @request mapping, users. Final URL, API, users. Example concept. Global base plus controller path means final URL method. 7, using Spring Webflux, if applicable. In reactive apps, spring.webflux.basepath equals API. Example concept. Webflux means separate base path config. Difference: context path versus request mapping. Context path server.servlet.contextPath equals API affects entire application, applies globally. Request mapping At request mapping API affects only specific controller. More flexible, example comparison. Type scope example. Context path. API users, request mapping controller level. API users, example concept. Context path equals global prefix request mapping equals controller prefix. Real world example, application.properties server.servlet.context path equals /API. Controller at REST controller at request mapping /v1/users. Public class user controller. Get mapping, public string, get users, return users API. Final URL, API, v1, users. Example concept. API plus XYV1 users means API, v1, users. Common mistakes. 1. Double prefix at request mapping, API, and server.servlet.context.path equals API. Result. API users. 2. Missing leading / at request mapping. Best practice. At request mapping API. 3. Mixing inconsistent paths, API users, orders, products. 4. Hard-coding base path everywhere. Instead of repeating API, use dot. Context path base controller mapping best practices. Best practices include: use /API as standard base path. Use versioning, API v1. Avoid duplication. Use context path for global control. Keep controllers clean with base mappings. Follow consistent naming. Example concept. Consistent base URL means scalable API design. Advantages include clean API structure, easier routing, better maintainability, supports versioning, simplifies gateway integration challenges. Challenges include confusion between context path and mapping, accidental duplicate paths, misconfigured properties, environment-specific base paths, concepts learned. By learning this topic, you understand what base URL means, how to use @request mapping, how to set global base path, difference between context path and controller mapping, how to implement API versioning, how URLs are formed in Spring Boot. Simple definition. Set base URL for REST in Spring Boot. The process of defining a common URL prefix for all API endpoints using controller mappings or global configuration. Final summary. Setting a base URL in Spring Boot helps organize your REST APIs and makes them easier to manage. You can define the base URL using @request mapping at controller level server.servlet.context path for global configuration. You can also combine both approaches to create structured APIs like API v1 users. Using a proper base URL improves consistency, scalability, versioning, maintainability.